The History of Philosophy, Modern Philosophy, Kant to the Present. Lecture 12.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight I want to continue and conclude our discussion of objectivism. In the first half this evening I want to consider certain epistemological points that we did not get to last week. And then after the break, I want to say something about the objectivist ethics and a few words at the tail end on the objectivist politics. Now, central to the objectivist epistemology, as you know, is the advocacy of reason. And the use of reason involves three crucial elements or factors. It begins with the evidence of the senses. It operates by the method of logic. It holds its knowledge in the form of concepts. Last week we looked at the objectivist view of sense perception and of logic. Let us now look to the objectivist theory of concepts to complete our survey for purposes of this evening of the objectivist view of reason. Now, as you undoubtedly know, the theory of concepts is a very complex question which cannot be covered adequately in any single lecture, let alone part of one, and so I can't attempt that this evening. A full presentation of the objectivist theory of concepts is to be found in Ayn Rand's Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, to which I refer you for details. My goal now is more modest. I want first to sketch in briefly simply the essence of the objectivist theory of concepts, so as to enable us then to contrast it with traditional approaches to the nature of concepts. And specifically, I will be building up to the point that for objectivism, concepts are neither intrinsic nor subjective, but objective, and that is the major point of contrast between the objectivist theory of concepts and the traditional theories. Well, let us begin with a brief statement of the role of concepts in human knowledge. In the broadest sense, of course, concepts have only one fundamental role or purpose, and that is to enable human beings to gain a knowledge of reality beyond that which would be possible to us strictly on the perceptual level, to enable us to achieve a wider cognitive awareness than is attainable on the perceptual level. Now the question is, how do concepts function so as to enable us to achieve this kind of greater knowledge of reality? And in a word, the cognitive function of concepts is to organize our perceptual material. And this includes many interrelated processes, one of which is particularly relevant here. Concepts enable us to organize our perceptual material by classifying the perceptual data in terms of similarities and differences. In forming a concept, we detect similarities running through a certain set of concretes that we perceive, a set of similarities that differentiate those particular concretes from the others that we know. We recognize that the same attributes are present in a given group, and that in this respect, these particular concretes differ from the other things we know. And on the basis of these observed similarities, we are able to isolate, separate, differentiate one group of concretes from the rest of our perceptual field. We're able to treat them as a separate class. Now this provides us with the first central cognitive function or role of concepts. Namely, they enable us, concepts to engage in specialized study. They enable us to engage in specialized study without which we could not embark on any quest for knowledge. Because we have a conceptual faculty, we're able to concentrate upon study one particular aspect of reality without at the same time having to study the totality of existence in our perceptual field, which would obviously be impossible. Our perceptual field contains at any moment a vast number of entities and aspects which, as far as simple sense perception is concerned, are all lumped together. As such, they're not differentiated. But granted we have a conceptual faculty, we can isolate, separate certain aspects, certain entities from this overall field. We can grasp that certain phenomena have something in common which differentiate them from the rest of the things we perceive. We conceptualize that group, and thereafter we can deliberately concentrate upon it for purposes of specialized study. On the other hand, if we were restricted to the perceptual level, we could not deliberately, to give you an example, go out and study man, because we'd be unable to grasp that men have something in common, unable therefore to isolate men as a class from the rest of our perceptual field, unable therefore to engage in any specialized study of man. Concepts, in a word, from this point of view, permit us to break up our perceptual field. And they do so by means of our ability to organize and classify perceptual data on the basis of similarities and differences that we detect. Therefore, one aspect of forming concepts, one crucial process in the concept forming process is the process of isolation, differentiation, separation of some perceptual concretes from all the others that we encounter on the basis of similarities that we observe which unite some group and differentiate them from the others. Now hold this point for a moment and let us look at a second main cognitive role of concepts. And that is that concepts enormously broaden the range or scope of material that we can deal with. Take any concept you have, for instance, water, and now have some thought about water. For instance, water is wet. Now, your concept here of water includes an endless number of instances, an indefinite number of instances. All the water in the past, all the water in the present, all the water yet to come in the future. Your concept does not include just the instances of water that you've actually experienced. It applies to a vast number of instances that you've never perceived and never will. Literally an indefinite number. And yet, because you have a concept of water, you are able in one mental unit, in one frame of consciousness, so to speak, you're able to have a thought which includes, applies, subsumes this indefinite array of instances. In this respect, conceptualization is a method of integrating perceptual concretes, an indefinite number of them, integrating them into a single sum or unit, so that an unlimited number of percepts are condensed into one frame of consciousness. And you contrast this with the state that you're in if you were strictly on the perceptual level. On the perceptual level, we're confronted with an endless number of concrete entities, vastly more than it would be possible to retain or deal with strictly by perceptual means. And the crucial point here is there's only a limited number of units which a human consciousness can hold before it at any given time. Indeed, this is true of any consciousness. Any consciousness is limited because A is A, and consciousness is finite, it's limited, it has a specific nature, which means in this connection there are only so many units it can focus on and retain at any given moment of awareness. For instance, on the strictly perceptual level, you can retain a distinct awareness, say, of 5, 6, 8 men. You can distinguish them perceptually in one glance, let us say. But you obviously can't do that for hundreds of men or thousands of men, to say nothing of the endless number of men, past, present, and future, that have, do, or will exist. Our mental space, if you want to look at it that way, is limited in the number of units it can hold in any one frame of consciousness. What we do when we have a concept, what that permits us to do is to condense into one unit of awareness this whole endless sum of percepts that come under it, so that in a finite amount of time, and with a finite mental space, we can nevertheless acquire knowledge of an endless number of concretes stretching across an endless period of time. In this respect, you can think of concepts as mental space savers. And it's because of this that they enable us to acquire a scale of knowledge that would be impossible on the perceptual level. Their means, concepts, are means of reducing to manageable, dealable with units, a quantity of concretes which on the perceptual level is too vast to be dealable with. Well, what then in sum, from this point of view, do we do when we form a concept? We isolate a group of perceptual concretes from their surroundings. We separate them mentally from the rest of the perceptual field. And this we do on the basis of similarities that we perceive them to possess, which differentiate them from all the other objects in our field of awareness. And then, having isolated a set of concretes, we proceed to integrate those concretes and all others like them, past, present, and future, into a single new sum or unit, which we thereafter treat as a single mental unit. And having done this, we can then engage in specialized study of the members of this particular group, and if we formed our concept properly, we can proceed to apply to every member of the class the conclusions that we learn by studying some members. So we can describe a concept at this stage as a mental integration of perceptual concretes which we have isolated on the basis of similarities that we've observed them to possess, which differentiate them from the rest of our perceptual field. Now, we've talked about integrating a group of percepts into a unit. Focus on that for a moment, because that'll reveal to us another aspect of the process of concept formation. When we reach the concept, we treat all the concretes that are subsumed under it equally as members of that one class, whatever it is, man, water, table, etc. In other words, we treat all the concretes, once we form the concept, we treat all the concretes that come under it as interchangeable from the point of view of the concept. The concept applies equally and indifferently to each and all of its instances. In other words, from the point of view of the concept, we treat all of the instances as the same, as identical. You are a human being, you are a human being, you are a human being, etc. And from the point of view of the concept, you are all equally human beings. If we couldn't treat all the instances as the same, then of course it would be impossible to have one unit refer interchangeably and equally to all of them. So, in order to reach the concept, we had to somehow, in some way, disregard the differences distinguishing the various concretes that come under it. And we had to simply focus or concentrate our attention on what is the same in all of them. But then, of course, the question arises, what is it that's the same? As far as perceptual awareness is concerned, there is normally nothing which is literally the same among the various concretes that come under a concept. If you perceive a number of chairs on the perceptual level now, you will notice that as far as perception goes, the things that are called chairs may vary in every respect you can perceive, in the size, in the number of legs, texture, in the color, etc. And that, of course, is equally true of men, who will vary in height, weight, fingerprints, degree of intelligence, and so on and so on. So we have this question on the perceptual level. We normally find nothing identical, nothing literally the same among all the instances. And yet, by the time we reach the concept, we are treating them all as the same. How did we do this? By what means are we able to treat as one unit, and therefore, i.e. as the same, a set of concretes which, as far as perception goes, may have nothing identical or the same about them? Now, this is where Ayn Rand's crucial point about the nature of concepts becomes relevant. Namely, that a concept is the identification of concretes with their measurements omitted. With their measurements omitted. Now, this is a complex subject. It would take, as you probably know if you've read Ms. Rand's work, many lectures to elaborate this point. But I want here simply to give you a summary statement, to give you an overview of this process. Tersely stated in terms of essentials, the objectivist view here is as follows. We distinguish two aspects in the concretes that are going to be integrated into a concept. The attributes of those concretes, that would be, for instance, aspects like length, weight, volume, and so on, and the particular measurements of those attributes in any particular concrete. For instance, 10 inches would be a particular measurement of length, 5 pounds of weight, 9 cubic yards of volume, etc. Now, in reality, no attribute can exist without some specific measurement, some specific dimension. This is inherent in the fact that reality consists of concrete. And the measurements of a given attribute may vary widely among the various concretes in any given class. Now, the whole objectivist theory of concepts rests on the fact that it's possible for human beings to grasp this distinction. In other words, to consider an attribute without at the same time attending to its specific measurements in all of the various concretes which possess that attribute. To mentally separate the attribute from its varying measurements. To let the measurement simply become a variable which can range across a whole scale, the particular degrees of which are not at the moment of concern or to be focused upon. Now, this process of attending to the attributes as apart from all the different varying measurements, we call the process of omitting measurements, And it is, according to objectivism, the essence of the process of abstraction. So the objectivist view of concept formation is then this. Having isolated some group of concretes from the others that we know, we then omit the measurements of all the attributes of those concretes. We don't specify or focus upon the measurements. Thus viewed, that is, viewed without the measurement specified, the concretes in question are identical. The attributes considered apart from the measurements are the same in all of the concretes that come under a certain concept. So we can say that conceptualization is a method or way of retaining or being aware of an endless number of concretes in one mental frame or unit of awareness by the device of omitting the particular measurements of those concretes. And thus the idea of the concept is the identification of the concretes with their measurements omitted. So, a brief overview now. All of the concretes in any class are related to each other in virtue of the fact that they possess varying measurements of the same attributes. In any class, the concretes subsumed are the same in their attributes and vary, or at least are capable of varying, in the measurements of these attributes. And what we do when we form a concept is simply retain the attributes which the concretes that come under that concept all have, which are the same in all these concretes, and omit from attention the varying measurements of these attributes in the various concretes. This is the heart of the objectivist theory of concepts. Concept is the identification of the concretes with their measurements omitted. Now, if you combine this point with the points that we made just a few moments ago, namely that concept is a mental integration, and that it's formed by grasping characteristics that are similar to certain concretes and that distinguish them from others, you put all that together in one succinct statement, you will reach Ayn Rand's formal definition of a concept, which I quote: a concept is a mental integration of two or more units possessing the same distinguishing characteristics with their particular measurements omitted. Unquote. Now, having set before you in the briefest possible terms the objectivist theory of concept, I want now to point out its distinctiveness by contrasting it with traditional theories of concepts, or universals as they're sometimes called, that we have encountered up to now. And here my theme, as I indicated, will be objectivism holding the view that concepts are objective as against either the intrinsic or the subjective approaches. Now consider first the so-called realists in the theory of universals, the Platonists and the Aristotelians, and take Plato first. Now he obviously held the view that universals are intrinsic. Universals, according to Plato, if you recall, exist in a separate reality, quite apart from this one, quite apart from any relation to man or any conscious being. They are entities in reality, special features of existence, entirely independent of this world, entirely independent of any and all consciousness. That's Plato's view. Now, Aristotle denied another world of universals. He didn't believe in a supernatural world of universals, but he still construes universals as metaphysical ingredients in particulars. If you recall his view as I presented it in the opening lecture of this course, his view was that every particular or every concrete consists metaphysically of two parts, or two ingredients: the universalizing element, as it's often called, and the particularizing element. The element that makes it a certain kind of thing, and the element that makes it an individual thing. The element, remember, that makes it a such, which the Aristotelians sometimes call its suchness, and the element that makes it a this, which they sometimes call its thisness. Now, on this viewpoint, every particular is metaphysically bifurcated into two different ingredients which make it up. And a concept stands simply for one ingredient of the two. A concept stands, so to speak, for half of an entity, the universalizing half as against the particularizing half. So the concept man, for instance, stands for one half, metaphysically speaking, of each individual man, the universal half. So that for the Aristotelians, universals exist in particulars in a very literal sense of the term. The universal-particular distinction is explained on the basis of two metaphysical constituents of concretes. Now again, on this theory, universals are intrinsic. Concepts represent one metaphysical element in existence, and an element which in no sense depends upon human beings or on the existence of consciousness of any sort. The universal is simply out there in reality. It's a special feature of existence, entirely independent of consciousness. Now, Aristotle, of course, differs from Plato in holding that the universal can't exist in a realm of its own apart from particulars. But he does agree with Plato on one crucial issue, namely that universals are metaphysical phenomena, intrinsic in reality, entirely independent of the existence of consciousness. And therefore his position is frequently called Aristotelian realism, his position on the question of universals. And it's called realism because, like Plato, he holds that universals are real, out there, independent of human beings or human consciousness. And of course Aristotelian realism to distinguish it from the Platonic variety. Now, jumping to the other wing in philosophy, beyond the realists, we have as the predominant alternative the nominalist school. And that school, of course, declares there are no universals. Human beings have simply decided, arbitrarily, to draw certain lines and say, we're going to draw certain lines in nature and say, we intend to call everything within this arbitrarily demarcated group by the same name. And our arbitrary naming procedures thus give rise to classifications. A concept for a nominalist is simply a name arbitrarily used to designate an arbitrary subjective grouping of roughly resembling particulars. Now, on this theory, we have an arch example of subjectivism in the theory of universals. Of the view that concepts are subjective, they are creations of human consciousness, independent of the facts of reality. And as we have seen amply demonstrated in any course in philosophy which goes from Kant to the present, this nominalist theory is the main source of skepticism and subjectivism throughout the whole rest of philosophy. Once concepts in this way are severed from reality, then all conceptual knowledge loses its ground, its base, its foundation. Whenever you prove anything by the use of concepts, the nominalists come back and say in one form or another, well, that's just semantics, that's just your way of using words, just your way of using names. And of course, on this view, there's no such thing as a right way or a wrong way, because reality is simply out of the picture. And thus we have, with the dominance of nominalism, the contemporary collapse into every form of skepticism and subjectivism. Observe the two basic alternatives that you were given regarding the status of concepts. The realists, Platonists and Aristotelians, regard concepts as intrinsic. The nominalists regard them as subjective. The realists say universals like tableness, manness, etc., are entities, or half of entities, if we take the Aristotelian view, are entities or half entities independent of consciousness. And they say conceptualization is really only a method of gazing at or contemplating these intrinsic entities or half entities. And in this sense, the realists construe conception as a kind of passive perception. There's a special object out there in reality, the universal, however they construe it. It's entirely independent of us, and the process of conceiving for them is essentially a process of passively gazing out and contemplating this particular intrinsic object. You see how they model conception on perception. In perception, there's a table out there, and we merely expose ourselves to it and gaze at it. And it, of course, is entirely independent of us. Well, they say in conception, there's a table hood out there. And again, we merely expose ourselves to it and gaze at it, and it too is supposed to be entirely independent of any relation to human consciousness. Now, this is the realist view. Now, the nominalists then merely have to come along, as they do repeatedly, and say, we can't find this special entity or half entity, this secret metaphysical ingredient. We can't find these mysterious universals. In reality, we can only find particulars. And consequently, they say, concepts are merely subjective, arbitrary human creation. You're given these two choices. Concepts are either intrinsic or subjective, either out there or in here, either phenomena of existence apart from consciousness or of consciousness apart from existence. Now, for objectivism, by contrast, concepts are neither of these two. They are neither subjective nor intrinsic, but objective. They are not phenomena of existence independent of consciousness, nor of consciousness independent of existence. They are products of a relationship between a consciousness of a certain kind and existence. They're products of man's mode of cognition and wouldn't exist without it. But man's mode of cognition operates upon facts of reality. And its operation, if it's rational, is dictated at each step by facts of reality. So that concepts are then phenomena which result from a consciousness of a certain kind, perceiving reality in a form inherent in that consciousness, which, if you remember the definition of objective given last week, means concepts are objective. Now let's pursue this just for a moment. On the one hand, concepts are not intrinsic. For objectivism, concepts do not stand for metaphysical universals, neither in another world nor in this world in the Aristotelian. They do not stand for special metaphysical ingredients in particulars. Now, I emphasize this. Objectivism does not divide particulars into two parts or two elements and then say concepts stand only for one of these two elements, the universalizing element. As apart from the fact that this is a completely groundless view, it is philosophically a disastrous view to take of the nature of concepts. It leaves the door, for instance, wide open to the existentialists, as we've seen, who say, well then, concepts, since they only focus on the universal element, miss out individuality, miss out particularity, and we have to resort to our blood and bowels to make up the difference. No, this is not how objectivism views it. For objectivism, concepts are simply man's method of integrating concretes into manageable, dealable with units by the device of disregarding the varying measurements of the particulars. But without man, without human consciousness, there would in this sense be no universals. There would be no concepts. There would simply be particulars, homogeneous, particular particulars. Because that's all there is in reality, particulars. So, from this aspect, concepts do not represent intrinsic ingredients. They are human methods of cognition. But now, in all of philosophy, when you fight off the intrinsic school, you have to immediately make clear that you do not thereby fall into the subjective school. It does not follow from what I'm saying that concepts are therefore subjective or arbitrary, a la the nominalist theory. Now, how would objectivism answer the nominalist? Well, what the objectivist theory does is explain that there is a metaphysical foundation for concepts, that conceptual groupings, while they are not intrinsic, are not therefore arbitrary. Well, what is then the metaphysical basis of concepts? Why isn't it arbitrary to group certain concretes under one concept? What is the same about them all? Well, the objectivist answer is there is definitely a metaphysical basis. It isn't arbitrary. What is the same about all the concretes that are subsumed under a given concept is they have the same attributes, the same characteristics. What differs is only the extent or degree of the attributes. And this is a fact about the concrete. It's in no sense a creation of or dependent upon human subjective convenience, etc. I'll take the example of the concept of length here as the simplest on which to illustrate the point. We can integrate various perceived lengths, for instance, the length of the table, the length of a pencil, the length of a ruler, and so on, into the concept length. The various lengths differ in measurement, but in each instance, the attribute, namely length, is the same in fact. The attribute does not differ from instance to instance. It's the same attribute. Only its measurements in a particular case differ. And therefore, by omitting the measurements, by not specifying, we are able to integrate the various perceived lengths into one single unit. We can treat them as the same in relation to the concept because, in fact, they're all instances of the same attribute. On the other hand, you cannot put together into one unit. If you think you can try right now. 3 lengths, the redness of a tomato, Rachmaninoff's 4th piano concerto, and the way to the Brooklyn Bridge. Now, you cannot integrate those into a single concept. And why not? Because, in fact, in reality, they represent different attributes, length, color, weight, etc. And we do not, therefore, have concretes which represent the same attributes but differing only in measurement. We have different attributes. And consequently, there is no metaphysical basis for any integration on our part and no way to perform it. In a word, conceptualization is in no way arbitrary or subjective. It's the actual nature of existence which determines how they're to be grouped, classified, and conceptualized. Now, suppose then somebody says to you, just to finish off with this question, suppose somebody says to you about some concept of yours, for instance, table. Well, where, according to you, is tableness or tablehood? because this is the way the question is characteristically put. Is it out there? I should say out there, or in here? Where is it? Now you're taking that just as representative of this whole category of question. The answer in pattern would be as follows. Individual tables exist out there. That they have the same attributes, including the same distinguishing attributes, is a fact which exists out there. That the differences are ones of extent or degree or measurement of the attributes is a fact which exists out there. That I have the capacity to retain the attributes and omit the measurements, and thereby to integrate all of these concretes into a single mental unit, that my consciousness has this capacity, that this is the form in which I grasp and identify this aspect of reality, that is a function of the nature of my consciousness, of my means and form of awareness. And this fact about the nature of consciousness, if you want to put it that way, is simply in here, meaning it derives simply from the nature of a human consciousness. Well, what then is the status of the concept table? Where is table? It represents facts out there, facts of reality, but as identified and integrated by a human consciousness. It's not a mystic glob in another dimension, or a secret ingredient in this one that inhabits tables in some mysterious way. Nor is it an arbitrary subjective fantasy. It's neither intrinsic nor subjective, but objective. That's its metaphysical status. Now, I don't think I need to emphasize to you the very great importance of this approach to concepts, because it gives you, for the first time in the history of philosophy, a validation of concepts as objective, a validation which neither turns them into subjective, arbitrary fantasies, nor which appeals, on the other hand, to mysterious intuitions into unperceivable ingredients. It's a theory of concepts which takes account of the role of consciousness and existence, and which is therefore able to base concepts squarely on the facts of perception, on the facts that we observe, without falling into the error of making concepts at some point mystical. And as such, this theory of concepts is an essential element in what is undoubtedly the most crucial epistemological achievement of objectivism, namely the validation of the human method of cognition, in other words, of reason, since concepts are so central to the exercise of reason. Now draw a line. We're going to jump to one more point in epistemology. One last topic before we get to ethics, and that is, I want to say something about the topic of certainty. Certainty. And I want simply to indicate to you how, in pattern, to answer the skeptics who constantly maintain, as you know, that certainty is impossible, that there are no absolutes, that nobody can be sure of anything. Now, that we have seen come up repeatedly in the more skeptical sides of contemporary philosophy, and I cannot resist saying something about that in presenting the objectivist view this evening. Again, this is a long, complex subject, but I will confine myself to one crucial aspect of the objectivist position with regard to certainty, namely the aspect which derives from the objectivist view that knowledge is contextual. The view that knowledge is contextual. Now, first, what is the meaning of this principle that knowledge is contextual? Well, in essence, it is very simple and straightforward. The principle that knowledge is contextual simply states that at each stage of a man's cognitive development, he has a certain context of knowledge. And by the context at any stage, we mean the entire field of the knowledge that he possesses at that stage of development. At each stage, a man knows what he knows and only what he knows. He doesn't know any more than what he does know. At each stage, he can come to conclusions, he can advance his knowledge only by reference to, only on the basis of, all the knowledge available to him at that stage, which serves as his cognitive context. Now, the objectivist view, to state it first, is simply this. When a man has integrated a given conclusion, non-contradictory, with the whole context of the knowledge available to him at any given stage, when he's taken into account all of the relevant available evidence, then he has every right epistemologically to regard his conclusion as valid, contextually valid. If his viewpoint or theory integrates with all the facts, the relevant facts known, and contradicts none of them, then in that context of knowledge, it is valid. Now, of course, the crucial point here is the opposite of the contextual theory, namely the demand for omniscience. Now, the crucial objectivist point here is that one cannot demand omniscience of human beings. Now, there are people who do that all the time, and this is a kind of a religious view of epistemology held by a great many avowed atheists. What it amounts to is taking God as the epistemological standard. And you'll recognize this type of person because he will come and say something like this. He'll say, well, if a being were omniscient, then of course he could acquire knowledge, because there is nothing new that he could ever discover which could conceivably require him to alter or revise any of his conclusions. He already knows everything. But they say, for a being with limited knowledge, a being that constantly makes new discoveries, how does he know what new phenomena he will discover that'll require him to revise or alter or abandon some of his earlier conclusions? How, they ask, does a man know, given any idea he holds, even if it makes perfect sense on the basis of the evidence so far available, how does he know that it won't be overthrown by some new piece of evidence as yet undiscovered? After all, they say, knowledge is limited. The conclusion that they come to is nothing is absolute, nothing is certain, there is no knowledge, and then they march down the skeptic trail. Now the question is, what is the answer, in principle at least, to this kind of query, which represents perhaps the most common assault on human capacity to know? Well, the answer lies in the principle that knowledge is contextual. I want to elaborate. First, I want you to identify the fundamental fallacy that is involved in demanding omniscience, in taking omniscience as the standard of human epistemology, which is what this argument does. Now consider, epistemology is a branch of philosophy. It's the branch which defines the means by which a human consciousness can acquire knowledge. And human consciousness, as we know, is something specific. It is what it is. It has a definite identity. It operates by conceptual identification of sensory evidence. Its knowledge at any point is limited. It's fallible. It's capable of error. Now, these are all facts inherent in the identity of man's consciousness. If so, and epistemology is the branch which tells you how does human consciousness acquire knowledge, then epistemology must build on these facts. It cannot deny or evade the nature of human consciousness. It cannot say, because man's consciousness has a specific identity, and we don't like that particular identity, therefore knowledge of reality is impossible. And that would amount, again, to the view, because man's consciousness has a specific identity, it can't be conscious of reality. In other words, it's unconscious. Because man's consciousness is something, therefore it doesn't exist. Now, any approach such as that is a gross contradiction, a gross revolt against the law of identity. And we've seen that in another form in the discussion of sense perception last week. The same thing is applicable here. In any taking of omniscience as the standard in epistemology. Now, objectivism takes man, the nature of man's consciousness, as the epistemological given, as the given. And it maintains that all epistemological concepts must be defined by reference to and on the basis of man's particular type of consciousness, its specific identity, its specific means of knowledge. Now, what does this mean in connection with our present discussion? It means that in identifying the status of his conclusions at any particular stage of development, a man has to say, in essence, the following: on the basis of the evidence I now have, within the context of all of the circumstances so far discovered, such and such a conclusion is valid. And I continue to go by the evidence, identifying what is available to me at each stage, neither denying what I know, nor pretending that I know everything. Now, if a man does this, and of course if he follows throughout the right epistemological methods, he will find that his knowledge at one stage will never be contradicted by his discoveries at a later time. He'll find that he expands his knowledge progressively, that he knows more and more, that he passes from more generalized, more primitive knowledge to more detailed and more advanced knowledge, but that no advanced conclusion need ever contradict the earlier ones, not if each was contextually validated by the appropriate procedures. Now, I'll give you an actual example here from the development of science, an example I've used in presenting this point a number of times because it makes the point well and very briefly. It's an example from the science of immunology pertaining to certain discoveries that they made about blood transfusions. Now, when blood transfusions were first attempted, it was discovered that in some cases the donor's blood was compatible with the recipient's, and in other cases the two bloods were incompatible, and an undesirable reaction set in, known as agglutination. And investigating this, scientists identified 4 types of blood groups, which are known, of course, as A, B, AB, and O. And only certain combinations of these are compatible with each other, so that an A-type donor, for instance, will always be compatible with an A-type recipient, they thought at this point, but he wouldn't be with a B, and there were equivalent rules governing the other possible combinations. So at this point they said an A-type donor will always be compatible with an A-type recipient. Then a new discovery was made. It was found that sometimes you could give A blood to an A-type recipient, and nevertheless agglutination occurred. They investigated further, and they uncovered another factor, hitherto unknown, what's called the Rh factor, present in some blood and not in others. They arrived at a new piece of knowledge, that under certain circumstances, then, the A bloods are not compatible. And they are so, at this point in knowledge, only if the Rh factors are also appropriately balanced. So if the initial principle, for short, that A's are compatible, if that was the initial principle, it was then discovered to hold only under certain circumstances that had earlier been unknown. And this progression of knowledge has continued. They've discovered M factors, P factors, and so on. Now, what I want to point out is that on this very example, that the new discovery in no way whatever contradicted the earlier knowledge. Not if the investigators at each stage specified their conclusions contextually. In other words, if they held their conclusions at the early stage in the form, within the context of the circumstances so far discovered, A's are compatible. If they held it in that form, that remains true. And it remains true permanently. Within the context of the circumstances known, the A's do remain compatible. Where then would there be a contradiction between the early claim and the later discovery? Well, only if the scientists had decided at a given stage, now we're omniscient. Context is irrelevant. All factors are now known. In other words, if they had asserted as an out-of-context, in effect, mystic absolute, A's will always be compatible under all circumstances, regardless of any further discoveries, regardless of any additional factors. Now, if they'd made a claim like that, they would be stepping beyond the grounds of what is epistemologically warranted. You cannot take any single discovery from the sciences and declare it an invariable absolute out of context. You can't say it's impossible ever to discover any further circumstances relevant to this phenomenon. If you do that, then of course each new discovery will contradict your previous claim. And you, or if not you, then the people watching you from philosophy classrooms, will end up saying, you see, knowledge is impossible. Each new discovery invalidates the preceding. However, if you specify each conclusion contextually, then any new discovery merely indicates new circumstances, new factors. You merely learn more fully about the facts on which your earlier formulated principle depends. You refine and expand your knowledge, but you do not contradict it. Now observe one last point. While a scientist cannot claim his discovery as an out-of-context absolute, he must treat it as a contextual absolute. It's only because he knows, and here I underscore, he knows. It's only because he knows what he knows that it's possible for him to go on to make new discoveries. It's because he knows how a thing acts under certain circumstances, the ones so far observed, that he has a lead, a basis, when he observes changes, to go on to make new discoveries. In a word, it's only because he is certain of the knowledge he has at each stage of development that he's able to go on to make new discoveries. So when the scientist in this example observed that in certain cases the A's were incompatible, they were immediately able to infer there must be some new factor operating here, because we know what we know up to now, and therefore we know that we must be in the presence of a new factor. In a word, it was precisely their contextual certainty that permitted them to identify the new factor and thereby expand their knowledge. Now you contrast this with what a skeptic would do, assuming he'd ever reached the point of saying that the A's were compatible to begin with. When he discovers the changed results of combining the A's, he says in effect, well, that just goes to show how unreliable my old conclusion was. My earlier knowledge is wiped out, and he simply stops dead. Now to summarize this point, the alternative is not that you feign omniscience and erect every discovery into an out-of-context absolute, or that you embrace skepticism and say that certainty and knowledge is impossible. Both of these, as I hope you now see, are merely variants on one theme, the theme being that omniscience is the standard. And then the dogmatist side then simply pretends to have omniscience, and the skeptics, on the other hand, bemoan their lack of it. Now, the correct view on this question is simply to reject altogether the idea of omniscience as the standard. To recognize that knowledge is contextual. It's absolute, it's knowledge, it's valid, it's certain, but contextual. So if you ask me, is certainty possible? I would answer, certainly, certainty is possible. All right, let us take a short break and then we'll turn to ethics. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let us now turn to look at the objectivist ethics. Now, there's a great deal of written material available on the objectivist ethics, and I'm going to rely to a great extent on your familiarity with this literature and confine myself to two types of topic in connection with our discussion of ethics this evening. First, I want to indicate to you in pattern how the foundations of the objectivist ethics are established, how the fundamental value judgments are validated. In other words, how in pattern the basic tenets and structure of the objectivist ethics are derived. And then, secondly, assuming that you're familiar with the detailed viewpoints of the objectivist ethics, I want briefly to give you an overview of the objectivist ethics from the aspect of the fundamental metaphysical and epistemological tenets that we've been discussing. I want to show you briefly how the very themes that we've been discussing in metaphysics and epistemology are also central to the objectivist approach to ethics. How the objectivist ethics carries out in the field now of morality the same principles that are essential to and distinctive to objectivism in the fields of metaphysics and epistemology. Now let's begin with the foundations of the objectivist ethics. And here, as you know, the fundamental question that we have encountered repeatedly in this course is the question, how do you get values from facts? The so-called problem of the is and the ought. How do you derive value judgments from factual judgments? And we have seen that philosopher after philosopher has foundered on this question. They've been unable to show that a code of ethics can be based on facts. And the result has been the repeated claim that ethics is baseless. It's the province of subjective whims or arbitrary commitments, emotive ejaculations, and so on and so on. Now, philosophy's position on this question, the question of the relation of value to fact, is far and away the most important aspect of its ethical position, because its answer on this question determines the essence of the rest of its viewpoint in ethics. Once you validate even one fundamental value judgment, then all other value judgments can in principle be justified by reference to the basic one. Once you would prove that X, whatever it is the good, objectively and in fact, you can then establish all other value judgments simply by considering any candidate for value and asking, is it consonant with, does it lead to X, or does it lead away from it? If it leads toward it, then it's right, it's good. If not, then it's wrong, it's bad, etc. But of course the crucial question is, how do you validate, strictly on the basis of an appeal to facts, the ultimate value judgment, which is the foundation of an ethics? Now, Ayn Rand's distinctive approach to this question is that she begins at the beginning. She does not take the phenomenon of values for granted and proceed to ask what are the right values for human beings to pursue. She does not try to take a survey of all human beings and see if she can unearth one value common to every man, which they all, as a matter of fact, pursue, a la the psychological hedonists, or even Aristotle, who adopted that kind of approach. She begins her approach at a much deeper level by analyzing the very nature of values. She asks, what is a value? Why does the whole question of values come up? What is the metaphysical source, the basis of the phenomenon of values? What are the facts of reality that give rise to and make possible the concept of values? And it's in answering this question that she finally reaches her conclusion as to what it is that should be the ultimate standard of value. Now let us follow her account here. We begin with a definition of the concept of value. Now, Ayn Rand defines a value as that which one acts to gain and or keep. That which one acts to gain and or keep. Or you could put it alternatively, a value is the object of an action. That which some action is directed to acquiring or securing. Anytime you have an object, an entity acting to gain and or keep it, then in this respect, that entity, that object, whether it be food or shelter or knowledge or money, qualifies under this definition as being a value to that entity. In other words, there's a variety of objects in the world, and there are various entities acting to attain and or retain some of these objects. This is the fact encompassed in the statement, entities seek values. And this is where we begin. Now, the first thing to observe for clarity is what is excluded from being a value by this definition. I think it should be clear to you, a thing cannot be a value if action is irrelevant to its attainment or possession. If you are guaranteed to have a certain thing, absolutely no matter what actions you take or don't take, or on the other hand, if you're guaranteed not to have a certain thing, absolutely no matter what actions you take or do not take, then the thing in question is not a thing that you have to act to gain and keep. In other words, it's not within the realm of value. Consider, for instance, the law of gravitation. And here I mean not the knowledge of the law, but the actual fact. The knowledge is something you have to take action to acquire. But I mean the actual fact itself. Now, the fact of gravity is independent of any action on your part. The law of gravity is neither good nor evil. It simply is as an inescapable fact. It does not confront you with any issue of, is it worth pursuing to keep it or not? It doesn't generate any question of value. The concept of value is possible because there are things regarding which action makes a difference. Things that you have to act if you're to get, and that you won't get if you refrain from acting for. If there weren't these type of things in the world, then the whole question of values wouldn't come up in the first place. Now, given this account, I'd like you to notice two interrelated conditions which have to be fulfilled in the universe if the concept of values is to be possible. First, value requires and presupposes a valuer. There must be an entity to whom a given object is of value. If we say there are to be objects for which an entity acts, that obviously requires there must be an entity capable of acting for certain objects. There must be an entity capable of generating action in the direction of an end or goal. If all entities were simply inanimate, were simply random passive reactors to random external stimuli, if the world was just a huge congeries, for instance, of billiard balls, just blind particles that strike each other and rebound simply by stimulus and reaction, if there were no entities that could generate motion toward any particular object, there would then be no values. We summarize this first point by saying there must be entities whose actions in some respects are self-generated. In other words, entities so structured as to be able to initiate or originate action in the direction of some object, as opposed to merely passively, mechanically reacting to random stimuli. And now, if value presupposes a valuer of this sort, there is a second condition also implicit in the account we've given so far. A value requires that the valuer be confronted by an alternative, in the face of which action is necessary if the value is to be attained. And this condition also follows simply from the original definition. We said that values are things you have to act to gain and keep, things you won't get if you don't take the appropriate action. Well, it is simply a restatement to say values presuppose an alternative. So if value is to be possible, the valuer has to be confronted with a constant alternative, to have the thing or not, the latter being a constant possibility, the thing's attainment or possession depending upon the valuer's continued action. As soon as you have a case where there's no alternative, as soon as you have a case where the outcome is the same, no matter whether the entity acts or doesn't act, then there can no longer be any question of values. Where there are no alternatives, there can be no values. So to summarize these two conditions, value presupposes and requires a valuer capable of self-generated action toward an object in the face of an alternative, such that without the action there would be no securing of the object. Now, so far we've simply analyzed what is implicit in the concept of value. Now we go to the next step of the argument. What entities in the universe fulfill these conditions and therefore alone make possible the concept of values? And here, Objectivism answers: living organisms. These alone are capable of self-generated goal-directed action. In other words, these alone are capable of being valuers, and these alone are confronted by a fundamental alternative, life or death, to be or not to be, an alternative in the face of which they have to act if they are to remain alive. Now I want to look briefly at each of these points, and my point will be in each case that on both of these counts it's only the existence of living entities acting to sustain their own life that makes the concept of value possible. Now I'll look first at the condition that value presupposes entities capable of self-generated goal-directed action. Now it's clear that one of the fundamental marks differentiating living organisms from inanimate matter is the ability of living organisms to generate their own actions in a goal-directed fashion. Now this point, I may say, is not distinctive to Objectivism, so I will say very little about it. It would be appropriate to elaborate it in a course on the philosophy of biology, but that's unnecessary here. You could give all sorts of biological evidence in favor of this, the fact that living entities alone manufacture their own energy out of the raw materials provided by the environment. You could point to the many obvious goal-directed activities of living organisms, metabolic activities, self-repairing activities, and so on, and that these activities, goal-directed activities, take place on all levels of individual cells, tissue, organ, on through the total entity. If you obliterated living entities, if you peopled the universe simply with inanimate billiard ball type entities or their equivalents, you would then erase the possibility of entities having or pursuing goals. You would erase the possibility of self-generated, goal-directed action. In other words, you would erase the possibility of value pursuits. You would erase the possibility of values. We'll now consider living entities in connection with the second condition I mentioned, namely that values presuppose alternatives in the face of which the valuer has to act if it's to achieve the value in question. Why is it that only living organisms are capable of self-generated, goal-directed action? Because only living entities are confronted with a fundamental alternative in the face of which they must act. And of course the alternative is existence or non-existence, life or death. Inanimate matter has no such alternative. It can change its forms, but it can't go out of existence. Consequently, it can't generate action toward any goal. There is nothing for which it can act. It's incapable of pursuing values. It's only a living entity that must constantly act in the face of a fundamental alternative, life or death. And here I quote the crucial passage on this argument from Galt's speech. Quote, "There's only one fundamental alternative in the universe, existence or non-existence, and it pertains to a single class of entities, to living organisms. The existence of inanimate matter is unconditional. The existence of life is not. It depends on a specific course of action. Matter is indestructible. It changes its forms, but it cannot cease to exist. It is only a living organism that faces a constant alternative, the issue of life or death. Life is a process of self-sustaining and self-generated action. If an organism fails in that action, it dies. Its chemical elements remain, but its life goes out of existence." Unquote. So, to summarize, values presuppose alternatives. There's only one fundamental alternative in the universe, existence or non-existence, and it applies only to living organisms, in which case it's referred to as life or death. Now the question arises, what do we mean by saying that this is the fundamental alternative? What do we mean by saying that this is the fundamental alternative? Well, in general, by fundamental, we mean that upon which everything else in a given field depends. That which gives rise to the derivative. That without which nothing else in a given field could exist. If then we're talking in the context of values, and we say that the alternative of life or death is the fundamental alternative, we mean that without the alternative of life or death, no other value-generating alternative would be possible. In other words, that if an entity were not confronted with the alternative of life or death, if it were literally immortal and indestructible, if its existence were guaranteed to it, so that no action on its part were needed to sustain itself in existence, then it would be impossible for it to pursue any other goals or objects at all. It's only the necessity of acting to keep itself in existence that makes possible the pursuit of values. That's what's meant by saying only the alternative of life or death is the fundamental alternative, because only that makes possible the pursuit of values. Now, the best way to see this concretely is by reference to Ayn Rand's example of the indestructible robot, which she refers to briefly in her essay, The Objectivist Ethics in the Virtue of Selfishness. Now, let's for a moment disregard point one and imagine we have this robot and that it is capable of generating action toward a goal. Let's suppose that it is capable of being of value. What, even in theory, now could it value? Now we're going to assume that it's absolutely indestructible. It does not require any type of action in order to sustain itself, neither on the level of its cells, if it has any, or its tissues, or its organs, or on the level of the entity as a whole. Its continued existence is wholly guaranteed, no matter what it does or what happens to it. And now you're giving advice. You are suggesting values to it. Now, which ones are you going to suggest? We've removed the life or death alternative. Well, you might be temporarily stumped. And you might say, well, why can't it do whatever it feels like? Let it run around the block, pay a visit to the Ford Foundation. Whatever gives it pleasure, whatever gives it enjoyment, whatever satisfies its desires. In a word, let it be a hedonist. You might say that for lack of knowing what else to say. To which Objectivism would answer as follows. Such a robot could have no feelings, no desires, no pleasures, no pains, could have no emotional or affective life at all. Objectivism would hold that only entities confronted by the alternative of life or death, of existence or non-existence, can have feelings of any sort. And here, because we must assume that the entity, that the living entity has the faculty of consciousness. But the point is that the indestructible must be emotionless, feelingless, affectless. Now, why? Well, consider first on the strictly physical, physiological level. And here I think the point is clear. That robot that we are hypothesizing couldn't, for instance, get any physical sensation of pleasure from eating. Because by hypothesis, it has no need of any action to sustain itself. In other words, it has no need to eat. It has no need, therefore, of nourishment, of taking in food. It's therefore not capable of hunger, and therefore incapable of getting any pleasure in the process of eating. There'd be no use telling it, don't hold your breath because you'll suffer, you'll be in pain. Because it has no need of any type of action. Therefore, no need of breathing, no need of oxygen. Consequently, no pain involved in holding its breath, assuming it had a breath. It couldn't have a toothache because there is no need of any action on the level of its cells and its tissues. There's no possibility of decay and disintegration, which has to be combated by a certain type of action. No possibility of pain. In other words, if we're talking on the strictly physical, physiological level, then the sensations of pleasure and pain are correlated with pro and anti-life states. Pain is a signal of harm to what? To the life of the organism, and pleasure of the reverse. If you take away the alternative of existence or non-existence, the alternative of life or death, you then remove the possibility of the physical sensations of pleasure, satisfaction, pain, want, and so on. Now you might say, well, but what about on the strictly psychological level? And let's assume for the moment that this robot is a conscious conceptual being. You might say, couldn't he conceive desires that were not mediated by physical, biological needs? Couldn't he get strictly intellectual or psychological emotion of enjoyment or desire or pleasure from acting in certain ways rather than in others? Which again, Objectivism would say, no, he couldn't. Because if we're speaking on a strictly psychological level, if there's no biological basis for the feeling, then according to Objectivism, there's only one other basis or source of a feeling, and that is in the value judgments of the entity in question. In other words, feelings are not irreducible primaries. They don't descend from God. If they don't have a biological basis, they must then have an intellectual basis. And that would be, as you know, in the individual's conclusions, his views, his judgments on questions of value, whether those are conscious or subconscious, verbalized or not. If an individual concludes that money is of value, he will get pleasure, let us say, in being showered with. But if he's Plato, in one of his more ascetic phases, he'll be repelled by the same shower. If an individual has the value structure of certain contemporary political figures, he'll be ecstatic over a favorable public opinion poll. But if he, for instance, is like Spinoza, to say nothing of a misanthrope, he won't. Obviously, objects and events in the world do not, as such, produce emotions, desires, and so on in people. Not if we're speaking now on the psychological level. Objects and events in the world produce emotions or desires only when and if evaluated in a certain way by the mind of the respondent. And evaluations are value judgments. You change the value judgments, and of course, the relevant emotions change, as is evidenced by any successful psychotherapy. The same objects and the same events, differently evaluated, lead to different feelings. Consequently, only an entity who antecedently passes value judgments, in other words, who already has values, can experience desires, pleasures, and so on. Speaking now, remember, on the psychological level. Now you see now why there is no point advocating hedonism to that robot. There's no point telling him, select as your values whatever gives you pleasure, satisfaction, fulfillment, emotional kicks, etc. Because unless he already has certain values, he has no possibility of pleasure, satisfaction, or fulfillment. His ability to feel presupposes an antecedent answer to the question, what to value? So he still turns to you and says, what should I value? In other words, on both the physical and the psychological levels, this robot that we hypothesize would be emotionless, affectless, desireless, unable to take a step in the direction of any object out of sheer apathy. Nothing would or could make any difference to him. He couldn't act for food or shelter or oxygen. He's indestructible no matter what. He can't act for money or fame or love. He's indifferent. He has no alternative confronting him which could generate value pursuits. And thus you see the objectivist view that the alternative of existence or non-existence is the only fundamental alternative. That it's only the fact that there are living entities confronted with this alternative who must act to sustain themselves, otherwise they perish. That it's only this fact that makes the pursuit of values possible. All the other alternatives, money versus poverty, knowledge versus ignorance, etc., become value generating only in the context of the existence versus non-existence alternative, and only in the name of securing one's existence. Now notice this latter. Of these two alternatives, only life requires action. You don't have to do anything to die. Death does not require action. Death is a state of cessation of vital action. Death is simply stillness, the absence of pro-life action. To attain death, you don't have to take any action. You simply refrain from acting and you die. Sit still, don't breathe, don't eat, put a stop to your vital processes. That is death. The existence, non-existence alternative generates values because one side, namely existence, life, requires a constant process of action on the organism's part. And thus the conclusion, an organism's life must be its standard of value. That which furthers its life is the good, that which threatens it is the evil. It's only the fact that there are living organisms who have to act to sustain themselves that makes the question of values come up. A universe of inanimate entities or of indestrucibly immortal ones could have neither the need nor the ability to generate value-directed action. As Ayn Rand says in a key sentence in Galt's speech, quote, "It is only the concept of life that makes the concept of value possible." And thus the conclusion, any code of values on the part of a living organism must have that organism's life as its fundamental standard of value. Reached the point where I said that any code of values on the part of a living organism must have that organism's life as its fundamental standard of value. Now, in the case of plants and animals, this occurs naturally and automatically. By their nature, plants and animals necessarily take those actions which their life requires. They're incapable of deliberately initiating self-destructive or suicidal behavior. Implicitly, life is the standard of value, automatically guiding their every action. Man, however, is a being of volitional, conceptual consciousness. He has no automatic, no built-in, no pre-programmed set of values. He has to choose his values, and this is where ethics or morality enters the picture. You know Ayn Rand's definition of morality, quote, "A code of values accepted by choice is a code of morality," unquote. So if a man is to be rational, he must volitionally recognize the fact that it's only the concept of life that makes the concept of value possible. He must choose to hold life as the standard of his moral code, and then proceed to define the methods of achieving it that are appropriate for him to take. What then is the proper standard of moral value? A valid code of moral values, in other words, a code based on the nature of reality and of man, must hold life as its fundamental standard of value. QED. Now, I've given you, in essentials at least, a proof of the foundation of a rational, objective code of morality. One based on the facts of reality and the nature of man. And I hope that now you can see the invalidity of such a question as, why should I value life? Now, this question has the same status exactly as the question, is reason rationally valid? Think for a moment about this question. Is reason rationally valid? Now, obviously, you could only ask this latter question if you had already accepted reason. Once you're appealing to rational validity, you've granted that reason is the cognitive standard. If it weren't, then the concept of rational validity couldn't arise or be appealed to. Well, the same principle is applicable to the question, why should I value life? Once you say value, once you make use of that concept, or of course any of its synonyms or derivatives, you have already, by implication, granted that life must be the standard of value. Otherwise, as we've seen, the concept of value couldn't arise or be appealed to. You would, in all such questions, be using value as a stolen concept. Well, so much for the problem of facts and values, or the is and the ought. It's the fact that there are living entities, the fact that they have to act to sustain their existence in the face of an alternative. It's these facts that make possible and necessary the existence of values. Facts, the ones I've just named, generate values. Or to put it another way, what a living entity is dictates what it ought to do. Now, given this basis, let's be much more brief. How does the objectivist ethics proceed in pattern from this point? Well, to begin with, if you're going to apply life as the standard of value in practice, you have to first specify to what species you are applying it. Take a mythical example. Suppose for some reason you were defining a code of morality for fish. Now, obviously, the question wouldn't come up for many reasons, but just as an illustrative pattern. Obviously, if you were defining a code of morality for fish, you would have to take its life as a fish as your standard. To say the obvious, life for a fish means life as a fish. And here is where the law of identity plays its crucial role in ethics. Each species has a specific nature. It has a specific means of survival dictated by its nature, and it must therefore follow a specific course of action if it's to survive. It can't survive in any random fashion by any random acts it wants to indulge in. Each species is something. It has an identity, and it has to therefore live in accordance with the methods of survival required by its particular identity. So if that fish that you were communicating with should, for instance, be perverse, and should decide, let us say, to leap onto the beach and lie there thrashing and gasping and so on, even if it were not necessarily immediately fatal, you have objective grounds to say that this is absolutely a wrong behavior on the part of the fish. On what grounds? No action can be moral if it in any way threatens or destroys the life of the organism, not if its life is the standard. And if the fish should retort that it gets its kicks that way, that's the way it gets pleasure, you would have to send him to some equivalent of a fish psychiatrist. In other words, objectivism is not hedonism. It recognizes, if not in the case of fish, then certainly in the case of human beings, that self-destructive pleasures are perfectly possible, and it does not say act whatever gives you momentary pleasure. For any specific organism, you have to specify its means of survival. And the good for that organism will be living in accordance with that means of survival. Well, we come then to man. The standard of value for man will then be man's life. His life in accordance with the human means and method of survival. And on this, you know the objectivist view, as is perfectly clear-cut. Man survives by the use of his mind, the use of reason, the active exercise of his intelligence. He does not survive by force or instinct, but by thinking, investigating, inquiring, and then acting on the basis of his conclusions to produce the values his life requires. Consequently, for objectivism, human rationality and productive action on its basis is the highest virtue. So when objectivism says that the standard is man's life, the full meaning of that is his life as a rational, productive being. Now I'll say a sentence in a moment about the objectivist concept of rationality. But here again I want to point out the role of the fundamental objectivist philosophy now in ethics. What is presupposed by the view that rationality is the highest virtue? Well, obviously, that presupposes the view that reason is valid. In other words, that reason is man's method for grasping the facts of reality. If that were not true, then there would be no basis for making the exercise of reason the supreme virtue in ethics. It is only because reason is the human means of contact with reality, of acquiring knowledge of reality. It's only because of that that living by reason is the essence of virtue for objectivism. In other words, the whole objectivist ethics rests in this respect on the objectivist epistemology, on the validation of reason. And that means on the validation of the senses, since reason begins with sensory data, on the validation of concepts, since reason operates conceptually, on the validation of logic, since that's the method by which reason acquires knowledge. If in your epistemology you claim that the senses are invalid, or that concepts are cut off from reality, or that logic is arbitrary, etc. In other words, if you detach reason from reality, you then close out the possibility of having an ethics of reason. In this sense, the objectivist emphasis on the virtue of rationality is the expression in ethics of its epistemological position that reason is valid. Reason in its every aspect, starting point, and method. Now, I can't, even in the briefest possible survey of the objectivist ethics, refrain from uttering in one sentence one other crucial point, which is, of course, the best-known single point, namely that objectivism in ethics is egoistic. I merely want to observe in a sentence that that is a direct consequence of the view that life is the standard of value. Life does not exist in the abstract. It exists only in individual living organisms. The alternative of life or death that inescapably confronts each individual living organism is his individual life or death. The very argument which proves that life is the standard of value establishes at the same time that this means for each individual that his own life must be his ultimate purpose. So that objectivism is egoism. Now, I assume that you understand that the objectivist concept of egoism is radically different from traditional varieties, radically different, I emphasize in particular, from the Nietzschean variety or the hedonist variety. Ayn Rand calls it the morality of rational self-interest. according to which each man lives by his own mind and for his own sake, neither sacrificing himself for others nor others to himself. In other words, reason applied to egoism yields the theory of rational egoism. The same argument which validates egoism for one man does so for each man. Consequently, the view that each man should live by the independent use of his mind, trade with others when such trade is to their mutual voluntary decision and profit. I trust you understand that egoism for objectivism does not mean doing whatever you feel like. We covered that in the case of the fish, but rather acting in accordance with man's life as the standard, doing that which is objectively required to sustain and promote your life as a rational, thinking, independent, productive being. Now, with this brief sketch of the objectivist ethics before us, I want now to look at it in relation to some of the central principles of objectivism that we've been discussing in other areas. And first, let's look at it in relation to the theme of the primacy of existence. In a great number of ways, the objectivist ethics is the first existence-centered morality. The first morality consistently to be based on and derived from the primacy of existence. And let me point out briefly several of the ways in which this is true. Well, suppose we begin at the very beginning and ask the question, why does morality even come up? Why does the whole question arise? Now, if you are an advocate of the primacy of consciousness, you will take as the datum which gives rise to morality the desires of some consciousness. That will be your primary. If you're a supernaturalist, primacy of consciousness, you will say, God demands that we act in a certain way. He issues commandments. He has cosmic whims, and these constitute the source of ethics. And as you know, there's a terrific number of people who subscribe to such a point of view. We saw Sartre saying that a few weeks ago when he quoted Dostoevsky to the effect, if God didn't exist, everything would be permitted. There would be no such thing as ethics. There would be no such thing as morality. Ethics derives and originates from a desire on the part of a cosmic consciousness. Now the social version of the primacy of consciousness simply secularizes this and says, why is there ethics? Because society has certain desires. Society demands that we act in a certain way. Society, in effect, issues commandments, and thus is generated the phenomenon of ethics. And, of course, the personal version of the primacy of consciousness says, I feel like acting in a certain way. I have my own whims, and these are what generates good and evil. The good is whatever I want. Now, against all of this, objectivism takes the primacy of existence view with regard to the question of the origin or genesis of morality. It says existence demands that one live a certain way. That morality does not arise owing to the whims of any consciousness, not supernatural, social, or personal, but owing to the facts of existence. And of course, the facts I mean here are the nature and needs of a living organism if it's to survive. If it's to live, it has to follow a certain course of action. Otherwise, it will be destroyed. As such, morality for man is a necessity of survival in reality. It's not a subjective luxury. It's not the feelings of some consciousness which originates or generates morality. It's life in reality. It's existence which requires it. So right at the outset, you see one primary way in which the primacy of existence manifests itself in ethics. Or here's another way. What does morality take as its data, as the given in regard to human beings? Now, objectivism answers again, the facts of existence, not the arbitrary desires of some consciousness. Now, this latter is very common. Consider, for instance, the widespread damnation of human nature, ranging from the view mildly expressed as all men are inherently imperfect, on through the more extreme versions of original sin, according to which, in Augustine's phrase, every man is born sordid and crooked, ulcerous and bespotted, and goes on from there. Now, how does this damnation of human nature as such arise? Well, the characteristic pattern is this. The philosopher gets to the realm of ethics, and he starts with certain arbitrary desires that he has. He says, for instance, I like man to be infallible and omniscient. I don't like the fact that it's possible for him to make mistakes. Or, if he's certain Neoplatonist Christians, he'll say, I don't like the fact that human beings have a body. I wish they didn't have a body. Or, if he's the Stoics in a certain mood, he'll say, I do not like the fact that human beings experience emotions. In other words, they start with some aspect of human nature that they happen not to like. And then they proceed to formulate their code of values accordingly, and to condemn human nature for not living up to this particular code. And thus you get the type of view, man is fallible, therefore he's imperfect. He has a body, therefore he's not perfect. He's capable of feeling, therefore, etc. Now, all of this, I think you can see, is the primacy of consciousness in action. What would the primacy of existence be on this type of question? Well, just what Objectivism does. It says you have to start ethics with facts, in connection with this question, with the facts of human nature. And you have to formulate your theory of values in strict adherence to the facts. You cannot equate the good with anything which is in opposition to the facts of reality, including the facts of human nature. Therefore, you cannot equate the good with infallibility, the absence of a body, the absence of emotions, with any impossibility, with anything which contradicts the facts. The facts come first, and the good is defined accordingly, not the other way around. If something is not possible to man in reality, then according to Objectivism, it cannot qualify as the good. And thus the Objectivist view that moral perfection is possible. Possible because it's defined in terms of values consonant with and based on the nature of man. And thus the Objectivist repudiation entirely of the idea of original sin, and thus the view that pride is one of the cardinal virtues, pride being moral ambitiousness, the bending of every effort toward achieving the state of moral perfection. Here again you see the primacy of existence with the repercussions through its view of man. Now this point, I may say, has not been advocated fully by any philosopher, even by Aristotle. Now he is on this point far and away the best in the history of philosophy, but there were certain elements of Platonism in Aristotle that were never fully eradicated. For instance, near the end of his Ethics, he goes on to specify what he regards as the ideal life. It's a certain type of contemplation. He makes the point that the ideal life as he sees it is not fully possible to man, only to God, and that it's only insofar as man is divine that he will be able to live this way. Well, of course, you see, suppose you granted that premise for a moment, Objectivism would say, if it's true that a man can't live this way, then he shouldn't live this way. You cannot say this is the good, only it's not fully possible to you. If it's not fully possible, on a primacy of existence view, that's out as a criterion of the good. Let's look at one more aspect of the primacy of existence in the Objectivist ethics. Consider now the general question of what does virtue consist of? Virtue now consist of for the various approaches. Well, if you are an advocate of the primacy of consciousness, what will virtue be? Well, after you get past the terrific amount of obfuscating language, it comes down to this. Virtue for an advocate of the primacy of consciousness is attention to consciousness. Virtue is subservience to the desires of the ruling consciousness, whatever it happens to be. The ruling consciousness is the metaphysically potent one. That's what gives rise to ethics. That, therefore, is what sets the content of virtue. And thus you get, from one school, to be virtuous is to serve God, to live as he demands. Or from another, to be virtuous is to serve society, to satisfy the social demands. Or from the third, to be virtuous is to act on your own arbitrary whims. And this last one, as you know, is what is called egoism by the great majority of people today. And this alleged theory of egoism is egoism as dictated by the primacy of consciousness. It's the idea that you should live for your own ends, but since reality has nothing to say as to how you should live, you simply take whatever arbitrary desires you personally have and follow them. So the traditional view of what constitutes egoism is simply the primacy of consciousness applied to egoism. Throughout all these three patterns that I mentioned, the essence of virtue is giving your allegiance to whatever you regard as the supreme consciousness, whether God, mankind collectively, or your own. Now, for objectivism, however, what is the content of virtue? Well, putting it in these broad terms, it is paying your respects to existence, paying allegiance to existence. Virtue is rationality, and rationality is focusing on existence, discovering facts and acting accordingly. Now you notice when she defines the various virtues, Ms. Rand makes a point of stressing the primacy of existence which underlies the formulation of every virtue. I quote just a typical representative point here. All man's virtues pertain to the relation of existence and consciousness. And if you notice the opening statement in every one of these virtues as she defines and characterizes them, they are all couched in terms of recognition of facts. Thus, for instance, rationality is the recognition of the fact that existence exists, that nothing can alter the truth, and nothing can take precedence over that act of perceiving it which is thinking. Or, independence is the recognition of the fact that yours is the responsibility of judgment, and nothing can help you escape it, and so on. Every virtue is characterized in terms of a recognition of facts. That's what virtue is for objectivism. So we can say that the essence of the objectivist approach to virtue from this perspective is making the primacy of existence the guiding factor in the actual living of your life. Rationality is really a consciousness functioning systematically on the premise of the primacy of existence, dedicating itself to perception, identification, recognition of facts, and to action accordingly. For objectivism, virtue, so to speak, is living the primacy of existence. It's the primacy of existence in action. Now, before we leave ethics, I want to make one final point. I want to call your attention briefly to the central role of the issue of the subjective, the objective, and the intrinsic, now in ethics. And I will be referring here to morality, to moral values, the issue of moral good and evil. Now, again, consider the history of philosophy on this question, and you will see that there have been two main schools on the question of the status of value. On the one hand, those who claim that value is intrinsic. that it's a feature out there in the world, like length or weight, a special constituent of things, apart from any relation to living entities, and of course apart from any relation to man. Now, the cardinal representative of this point of view, far and away the most influential and famous, is Plato, who, as you probably know, has a separate form or universal of goodness, which he regards as the supreme principle in the universe and which shines down or irradiates to the things in this world. A thing for Plato is a table, insofar as it reflects the form of tableness. Well, similarly with goodness. Things participate directly in goodness, and they are good insofar as they have this intrinsic feature. If you wipe out all living beings and all conscious beings, goodness for Plato goes on untouched, unscathed, unaffected. If you ask Plato, what is the goodness good for? There's no answer. If you ask him, to whom is the good good? There's no answer. You have the idea of value as a kind of mystic law inherent in certain things or actions, divorced from valuer, beneficiary, or purpose. And that is one line that has been taken by all those schools influenced in this respect by Plato. Now, as against this intrinsic view, there are the subjectivists on the question of value. I don't have to give you examples after a course going from Kant to the present. Subjectivists hold that the good is entirely subjective. It's determined by random whims, urges, desires of people, whether one or many. In other words, that reality, existence, is irrelevant to ethics, to values. Now, I hope you can see that these two schools are simply variations on a theme. In both cases, if you ask them, how do you know what's good? How do you arrive at your particular conclusion of what's good? The answer, again, after you penetrate through mounds of verbiage, is you consult your feelings. For the subjectivists, this is explicitly so. They say that openly. What about for the Platonist intrinsic side? Well, they don't say that openly. But what Plato himself says is you have to go through years of higher mathematical training, and at a certain point, you have an ineffable mystic experience of goodness. You cannot put it into words. You cannot conceptualize it. You can't defend it in reason. You simply have a mystic insight into this intrinsic goodness, and when you know, you are blinded by the revelation, and you know, which is, of course, an extreme form of mysticism, and you know that mysticism means ultimately you are relying on your feelings. Both of these approaches to value, that it is intrinsic or that it is subjective, remove reason from value theory. In other words, from ethics. Only a theory of value, which is neither intrinsic nor subjective, can bring reason back into ethics. And that, of course, is precisely what the objectivist theory of value is. Now, we're speaking here of moral values, as the values insofar as they must be chosen by man. Well, they are not intrinsic. The issue of good or evil arises only because, as we've seen, there's a being of volitional consciousness that's confronted by alternatives and must choose among them. The good is good to man for the purpose of life. It's not a separate mystic packet in things. The good implies a beneficiary and a purpose, and wouldn't exist without them. In this sense, it is not intrinsic. But this doesn't mean that the good is subjective. Because the whole question, as we've seen, arises because man lives in reality, because he's confronted constantly by the fundamental alternative of life or death, in the face of which he has to act, because reality demands that he follow a specific course of action if he's to survive. The good, in other words, arises because a being of volitional consciousness has a certain relation to external reality. Both man and reality are essential here. And as such, the good is neither subjective nor intrinsic, but objective. Now, the best brief formulation of this is by Miss Rand in her article, which I called to your attention for study on this point. Her article, What is Capitalism? She summarizes very clearly the contrast between an objective theory of value and a subjective or intrinsic one. And I'd like to quote that passage. Quote, "The intrinsic theory holds that the good resides in some sort of reality independent of man's consciousness. The subjectivist theory holds that the good resides in man's consciousness independent of reality. The objective theory holds that the good is neither an attribute of, quote, things in themselves, nor of man's emotional states, but an evaluation of the facts of reality by man's consciousness according to a rational standard of value. Rational in this context means derived from the facts of reality and validated by a process of reason. The objective theory holds that the good is an aspect of reality in relation to man, and that it must be discovered, not invented by man. Fundamental to an objective theory of values is the question of value to whom and for what." Unquote. Now, this approach to ethics, I think you see, is central to the objectivist approach, and it is because Ms. Rand did not take the good as intrinsic or subjective that she could identify the conditions under which moral values arise and thus establish objectively, for the first time, what is a proper standard of value in ethics. Now, on this note of the good as being objective rather than intrinsic or subjective, let us make our final point for this evening, namely, let us make a transition from the objectivist ethics to its politics. Now, I assume you understand the objectivist politics. I can give you a volume or a sentence. I'll give you instead just a sentence. The essence of it, of course, is that no man may initiate the use of physical force against others to gain a value. That every man possesses inalienable individual rights, that these rights can be violated only by the use of physical force or fraud, which is an indirect form of force, and that this fact sets the proper function of government, to bar the use of physical force in social relationships, to protect the rights of the individual from violation by force at the hands of others. Now, this political view, and I trust you understand that that means, of course, laissez-faire capitalism, this viewpoint depends on the final practical expression of every element in the objectivist philosophy. Consider it for a moment simply from the point of view of the intrinsic subjective-objective issue. Because if you hold either an intrinsic or a subjective theory of value, you will be led unavoidably at some point to the conclusion that the initiation of force against others is acceptable, is proper. Both of these schools of value end up with essentially the same politics, namely the advocacy of force and violence. And you can see this most clearly, I think, if you go back to ancient Greece for a moment and think of the sophists, who were a school of skeptics, subjectivists in the ancient world, and Plato. The sophists were, of course, subjectivists as far as the good is concerned. And now, what did they conclude? Well, they said there's then no way to deal with other men by reason. There's no objective facts relevant to resolving our disputes. The good is simply a matter of arbitrary feeling. If two people disagree, I want him to do X and he doesn't want to do X, There's no criterion, no standard, no frame of reference objectively to appeal to, and therefore all we can say is whoever has the biggest club wins the object. Might makes right. A direct consequence of the view that value is subjective. Now Plato, representing the intrinsic view, was very opposed to the sophists. What did he end up advocating politically? Dictatorship by the philosophers. In other words, again, the rule by force. On what grounds? Well, since the good is mystical and ineffable, he argued, only a very few people that he had specially trained with special environment and so on could know it. You have to have this mystic intuition. Consequently, the mass of mankind is incurably ignorant. You can't expect people to live rationally if you leave them free. You can't expect them to discover the good themselves. They must be ruled by the few who get the special revelation. Common to both the subjective and the intrinsic view is that the good cannot be discovered by reason, and therefore men must live ruled by force. Now, on the other hand, if you hold an objective view of values, you have undercut the basis for the idea that you can achieve the good by force. On the objective theory, the good is not intrinsic. It's an aspect of reality as rationally evaluated by a man. Well, nothing then can be good for a man until his own mind understands that it's good and evaluates it accordingly. Since force is the antithesis of mind, the attempt to achieve the good by force would be a grotesque self-contradiction. That's in brief pattern why only an objective theory of values, as distinct from intrinsic or subjective, makes possible a politics which prohibits force. Now, I don't want to imply that the objectivist politics follows simply and exclusively from this view that values are objective. Obviously, every fundamental element of the objectivist philosophy is presupposed by the objectivist politics. If you took away any one of these elements, the politics would not stand. To give you just a few obvious examples. You could not defend the very concept of individual rights if you didn't subscribe to the primacy of existence approach. If you're on the primacy of consciousness approach, on the supernaturalist version, what is the source of rights? God. Rights are a gift from God, and you know, of course, that view makes rights mystical and logically indefensible. On the social version of the primacy of consciousness, the source of rights is society. Rights are a gift of society, and of course that means that they can be revoked whenever society so decrees. In other words, there are no rights, you exist simply by permission of society. Only on the primacy of existence view can you defend the concept of rights. Rights are conditions of human life required by existence, by man's nature and the facts of reality, for his proper survival. The source of rights is facts of reality, not the arbitrary desires of any consciousness. And here I remind you of Ayn Rand's point that the source of man's rights is not divine law or congressional law, but the law of identity. That is simply the primacy of existence applied to the topic of rights, and it's indispensable to a rational validation of the concept of right. Or again, you couldn't defend the view that men should live by reason rather than by force if you didn't have behind you a whole epistemology validating reason. Or again, you could not defend the view that the fundamental right is the right to life if life were not the fundamental value, the fundamental standard of value. Or you couldn't defend the view that man has a right to the pursuit of his own happiness except on an ethics of egoism, that each man is an end in himself and he therefore has a right to live for his own interests, his own welfare, his own happiness. Or again, you couldn't answer the charge that capitalism is good in theory but not in practice if you did not ultimately attack the whole mind-body dichotomy, which means, as we saw last week, back again to the primacy of existence. Now, we could multiply these examples endlessly, but I think you see the point. The defense of capitalism presupposes an entire philosophical system. Politics is simply the final social application of a metaphysics, an epistemology, an ethics. If you're given the right, and here I mean that in the sense of correct, not conservative, if you're given the right metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, the politics follows very simply. If you're given the wrong ones, then a rational politics is impossible. And here I need merely point to the whole history of philosophy and of the United States in the past century. In this sense, objectivism, for the first time, gives a full philosophical, metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, a full philosophical defense of and basis for the whole theory of individual rights and the political system of capitalism. Well, this is not the end of what one could say about objectivism in relation to the history of Western philosophy, but it's certainly the end for tonight, because it's all that I can possibly work in. We have now reached the end of this course. I've tried to trace the development for you of the central ideas from Kant to the present, pointing out the crucial turning points, evaluating as we go, showing how it all culminates in this century. I hope you now see more clearly what is distinctive about objectivism, what is its relation to traditional philosophies, what is its historical role. Around us at the present time, philosophy is in the midst of abdicating and dragging the Western world down with it in the process. Of the two main movements in the world today, one of them, the analysts, proclaim that philosophy is a disease, and the other, the existentialists, in effect that the universe at large and life as such is a disease, and that we have to abandon reason. Now, in the face of this, if civilization is to survive, it desperately needs philosophy, and a very specific type of philosophy. It needs a philosophy which advocates the primacy of existence, the law of identity, the absolutism of reason, an objective code of values, and a rational defense of man's rights. You know what philosophy I have in mind. Well, I have now finished my story of the past. I've told you what's happened up to now. As far as the future is concerned, that story is not yet written. That's up to each one of us in this room. Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll take just a minute, and then we'll get as many questions as we can in. See what we can get done. What is certainty? Is certainty an emotion or an intellectual judgment? I never did give you an objectivist definition of certainty, so let me do that. To begin with, certainty is not an emotion. There is a sense of the term in which you can speak of feeling sure that something is the case, even though you have no basis for that feeling. And in that sense, the word is sometimes used to designate an emotion, but clearly I'm discussing it in an epistemological context. I do not mean it as an emotion. Objectivism defines certainty contextually as follows. We distinguish between three different assessments of evidence: possible, probable, certain. And certain, remember, in forming any concept, you distinguish it from others. Certain is distinguished from possible and probable. To say that something is possible is to say that in a certain context of knowledge there is some, even if not very much, evidence in favor of the proposition and nothing known which contradicts it. Remember, in all cases you cannot make any claim without some evidence. But possible, because otherwise your statement is simply arbitrary, and an arbitrary statement is epistemologically disqualified. But to say that something is possible is to say there is some evidence in favor of it, even if very little. To say it's probable is to say there is a significant amount of evidence. And of course there are degrees of probability, but you begin to say it's probable rather than merely possible when, in a given context of knowledge, the preponderance of evidence is in favor of that conclusion, even though the evidence is not yet conclusive. And here again it's contextual. And we now complete the continuum. If possible is there is some but not much evidence in a given context. And probable is the weight of the evidence, the preponderance of the evidence is in favor of a position even though it's not yet conclusive. Certainty is the condition in which, in a given context of knowledge, the evidence is conclusive. In other words, in that context, no alternative qualifies even as possible. When you have a condition where all available evidence in that context points to one conclusion, and there isn't even a jot of evidence to suggest an alternative, then you are entitled to say you are certain, contextually certain, meaning on the basis of the evidence available to you, everything points to that conclusion, and there isn't anything that would suggest another one. Now, some of you know this example, but it's the best way I know to make it clear. Take the question, can you be certain that it's me, Leonard Peikoff, now lecturing? Now, I mention that as an example because I once had an instructor in college who tried to show me that there couldn't be any such thing as certainty. He said to the class, can you name something that you're certain of? And I said to him, I'm certain that you just asked a question. And he said, well, you can't be certain of that because how do you know it's me? And he gave his name rather than an imposter. And I stopped at that point. But I suppose you pursue that just for a moment, just to illustrate the question of contextual certainty. How do you know it's me rather than a consummate actor taking my place? And the only answer to that is that all of the evidence available to you leads consistently and exceptionlessly to the conclusion that it's me. The tone of voice, content of what I say, appearance, etc. Now, as if a skeptic walked in at this point and said, but isn't it possible that that's an actor? How can you be certain? The question you'd have to ask is, on what basis do you say that's possible? Where is there even some evidence for it? And here, there is none. Now, contrast this with a situation where there might be some evidence, and where you might validly be uncertain. For instance, if my voice occasionally breaks, it sounds fine. When I turn at certain angles, I look peculiar. Occasionally, I utter dubious remarks. Now, at this point, you might begin to entertain some hypotheses. Now, you don't have any conclusive evidence yet, but you have evidence that would be consonant with a number of different hypotheses. And you could say, well, maybe he's sick or he's enormously upset, whichever. Now, up to this point, I don't think you'd be justified even in hypothesizing that I was an imposter. But now, just to pursue the line for a moment, carry it. Suppose I suddenly announce that Kantianism is the greatest philosophy in the history of the world. And one ear began to sag. And I didn't recognize people that I'd known for years. Now you have evidence to say, well, maybe he's gone crazy. Maybe he's an imposter, whichever. And then, just to conclude the story, suppose suddenly the mask falls off, and Boris Karloff is revealed. Then you can say it's an imposter, I'm certain. Now, the point is, you go on the basis of the evidence available to you. And if all of the evidence, without any exception, points in one direction, and there isn't any to suggest a counter possibility, then in that context, you are entirely rational to say, I'm certain. Certainty is the status of a conclusion when all the evidence available in a given context points to it, and nothing points in any other direction. Now I'll try to mix in some from this week and some from last week that I saved. Since you define the category of objective as the perception of reality via the mechanism of a particular sense organ, and you exclude from this category the awareness of a pink rat, I would like to know for what reason you exclude this awareness from the category of objective. If it is not a perception of reality, of what is it a perception, or if it's not a perception, what is it? Well, in the strict sense, the perception of a pink rat is not a perception. It is a hallucination, in which a dream would come under the same category. Now, hallucinating and dreaming are not categories of perception. Perception is a process of looking out and being aware of some aspect of reality. A hallucination or a dream is a process of looking in and attending to some image that you have in your own mind. So these are not examples of sense perception. They are examples of mental imagery, which has acquired a certain vividness for a certain reason and on which you are focusing. Needless to say, such experiences presuppose past perception. You had to have perceived reality, perceived rats, and so on, in order to be able to hallucinate a pink rat. But that doesn't mean in the moment that you have it, that you are perceiving a rat. You are, in the strict sense, not perceiving, you are simply introspecting and studying a particular image. And that's why we say in that situation, in that moment the phenomenon is subjective. In that moment it is not a state of perception, but a state of contemplating a product of consciousness detached from reality. Now, does the proposition existence is identity require further derivation? And if so, would the following statement be a valid derivation of it? The concept one man and the concept existent man is the same thing, and therefore existence is identity. Now, I would say no. You cannot ever argue such and such and such and such, and therefore existence is identity. To begin with, you couldn't have the concept one before you had the more primitive concept something. One is already a more advanced quantitative concept, which presupposes that you would have formed the concept of identity. So I would not accept that argument as formulated. But I point out to you simply, it is always a fallacy to say such and such, such and such, therefore existence is identity. Existence is identity. In other words, A is A, the law of identity, is the precondition of all reasoning. You cannot therefore talk about logically deriving it. You cannot talk about showing that it follows from certain premises, because no process of reasoning is possible until you already know the principle of inference which guides the reasoning. And the principle of inference, the fundamental one, is of course the law of identity. So any attempt to derive the law of identity by reasoning of this sort commits the fallacy of begging the question. The only sense in which you, quote, derive it is the sense in which you arrive at it. And you arrive at it, as we indicated last time, simply by perceiving reality. In any one instance, implicit in that perception is, there is something which I'm aware of, even if you haven't explicitly formulated that. And that awareness that what you're aware of is something is all that's required to arrive at the law of identity. There's no question of deriving it by some logical means, or you simply beg the question. Give me 1 second. There are many ways to survive even for long periods of time. How, in principle, can one rationally choose among them? In other words, what more specifically is man's life? Well, you're asking in this question for a full-fledged account of the objectivist ethics. There are ways of surviving, if you mean by survival, enduring in existence by following anti-life procedures and counting upon the fact that other human beings will follow pro-life procedures. You could not do that on a desert island. On a desert island, if you attempted to survive by violating the requirements of human survival, you would very quickly find out that there were not many ways to survive. And if you lay around in a stupor or decided to beg for handouts from God rather than produce, etc., you would quickly find there's only one way. Now, the objectivist point is that these conditions of human nature and the demands of reality do not change when you're in society. That you have no claim on other people, and therefore the method of survival which you have to use in society is in principle the same as the method that you have to use on a desert island. Namely, adjust yourself to reality, use your mind, produce the values required. The only difference being, because you live in society, you can specialize, you can have a division of labor, and therefore you can trade the products of your production with those of others and achieve a much higher standard of living than you could by yourself, assuming, of course, that it's a rational society. But in this sense, the only way in which human beings can survive is by the exercise of their minds. The only reason it appears that a person can survive without that is that he is counting upon the people who live otherwise to carry him, either by the use of force, one method he's relying on, or on the doctrine of altruism. Well, if objectivism wins out, that will quickly deprive him of those means, and he will find that in reality there is only one way to survive. For further details, read Atlas Shrugged. Are there any types of knowledge which are certain not only contextually but absolutely? How about the laws of logic? If I understand the drift of this question, I would say yes. First of all, I don't mean to suggest that contextual certainty is non-absolute. It is absolute. Meaning by that it is based, if you really are certain, there's no such thing as relative certainty. But if the person means, are there propositions which are such that you do not have to even implicitly say on the basis of the evidence available, I would say yes. There are such, and those precisely are the ones which are the fundamental ones in philosophy, because those are the ones that govern all subsequent interpretation of the evidence. For instance, the law of identity. You would not have to say about the law of identity on the basis of present knowledge A is A, because you know that A is A is the law governing what will constitute knowledge. That's the principle of logic, and therefore the principle that tells you when something qualifies as knowledge. Therefore, there cannot be any evidence relevant to the status of that proposition. In other words, you have to distinguish fundamental philosophic principles, such as existence, consciousness, identity, the basic principles of metaphysics and epistemology, which are the framework telling us how to interpret evidence, from the typical claim to knowledge in the various sciences, in which you depend upon the particular evidence available, and you know that more evidence is coming in. In the case of the fundamental philosophic axioms, they're still contextual only in the sense that you have to have some knowledge to arrive at them. But you don't have to delimit them in the same way, because nothing can come up relevant to expanding or specifying them, since they're the criteria which govern everything else. Please contrast the objectivist view that man must use his built-in conceptual faculty as a means to knowledge with the Kantian view of built-in perceptual filters. Well, there's no similarity whatever. Every epistemologist holds that human beings have some cognitive capacities which are innate, the sheer capacity. Obviously, you couldn't acquire knowledge if you did not have some means of knowledge. And you couldn't go out and acquire the means of knowledge from scratch if you didn't have any means to begin with. So on any theory of epistemology, you must grant that human beings have some faculty of cognition, and that the faculty as such is innate. Now, it therefore doesn't distinguish any epistemology from any other. If you're an empiricist, you believe that you have the capacity for experience. If you are a rationalist, you believe that you have the capacity to get messages from the divine or whichever. Now, the radical difference among epistemologists is, what do you start with? Now, objectivism says we start with the capacity for sense perception and the capacity for abstraction, which, as you know, is ultimately analyzed in terms of the capacity to omit measurement. But these are simply capacities for grasping or being aware of reality in various forms. They do not distort reality. They don't create another reality. They don't add dimensions into reality that are not there in reality. They are simply the human form of being aware of reality. Now, this is in radical contrast with the Kantian view, that what we have is not simply a form of awareness, a capacity to be aware in a certain form, but mechanisms which take the initial evidence from reality, juggle it all around, distort it, add 14 odd characteristics to it, and then pass it along the chain to give you an entirely different world. Now, there's no similarity whatever. The questioner underlies built in. But every epistemologist, as I say, starts with something built in. But it's a big difference whether what's built in is a capacity to be aware of reality or a necessity to distort reality. I had some. Is there any sense whatsoever in which one may, in objectivist terminology, say that attributes qua attributes do exist out there? Or must one say that only concretes exist and therefore attributes cannot be said to exist out there qua attributes? No, I think attributes exist out there qua attributes. This is a question of metaphysical categories, but I don't see, if one understands what is meant by attribute, and I assume it means in this connection, an aspect of an entity which cannot exist separately from the entity. As, for instance, the attribute of length cannot exist by itself apart from the thing which has the length. Now, if all you mean by attribute is that, then it's true out there in reality that the length is an aspect of the entity and that it can't exist apart from the entity. That neither of those are, in fact, dependent upon human consciousness. And in this sense, attributes exist out there, following the question, qua attributes. Now, that does not mean they exist by themselves apart from entities, because an attribute is an attribute of an entity. But if you mean this in the strict sense, I would say yes, they do. In the metaphysical sense, what is the meaning of the concept nothing? Nothing. The concept nothing, if you take it metaphysically, stands for the absence of anything, and therefore has no reference. There is no nothing in this sense in the universe. And if you ask the question, well, what's outside the universe? I'd say there's no outside the universe. Outside the universe would allegedly designate the realm where existence is no longer. Well, if it's the realm outside of existence, there's no such realm, because only what exists exists. Consequently, I would here used Parmenides' formulation. There is no nothing. Nothing is not a special type of something. And as such, it doesn't designate anything. It's the old question of what happens to the whole when you eat the donut. Right? The whole is not something, and nothing happens to it. Now, the only sense in which you can use the concept nothing is to designate the absence of particular things. I say there's nothing on this table, meaning there are no books on the table, or whichever. There's nothing in my pocket, meaning I have no money in my pocket. You can use the word nothing in this sense to designate the absence of specifically defined things. But if you mean by nothing an absolute metaphysical zero, then no, you can't, there is no such thing, and the concept stands for nothing. I had one on nothing here, if I could find it. Yes. Would you please distinguish between void and space? He says between void and absolute space. By void, we here mean the nothing, das Nicht. And I've already commented on that. Space is not the same as nothing. So they're two entirely different concepts. First of all, objectivism does not recognize what's called absolute space. Absolute space is regarded by, it has almost no defenders any longer, but is regarded as a kind of gigantic non-material container in which everything is situated. And the idea was even if you annihilated all objects, this huge container would still go on. Now, objectivism rejects that view along with Aristotle and Einstein. So here, it's not very controversial view. Space designates a relationship, not a thing, not an entity of any type. When you say that there is space between two objects, you are simply focusing on the fact that they occupy different places, and you're focusing on that there are two different positions simultaneously. That's all. One is here, and you say there's space between them. That simply designates a relationship between entities located with respect to different surfaces, at different points on different surfaces. But if you abolished all entities, there would be no space left. It's not a thing, it's simply a relationship between entities. And in this sense, it's like similarity. Similarity is not a thing, it's a relationship between entities. If you wiped out entities, there'd be no similarity. The same is true of space. But given physical entities, you can perfectly well talk about space between them if you understand that that's a relational concept. That is not the same thing as a void. This is one I want to comment on. The light rays given off by that table fall in a certain range of the spectrum. Isn't the colorblind man wrong when he says it's gray, in the sense that he is unable to distinguish that range of light rays from others? No, he is not wrong. And your question here gives away the answer. He is, let us suppose, he does not have the capacity to discriminate certain range of sense experience, certain light waves from others by direct sense experience. So when he looks at two different shades of green that you can discriminate, he can't. Is he wrong? No. Suppose he sees it as one solid spread of gray. This simply means that's the form in which he perceives that particular object, and that there are certain types of differences that he is not able to discriminate by direct experience. Does it mean he will come up with a different theory of physics from the normal person? No. If you interview colorblind physicists, you will find that they do not have any different views on the question of light waves, and that the phenomena which we, as people with normal vision, can discriminate directly, that there are certain differences, they have to arrive at indirectly, by inference from what they do perceive. And they get enough data about the behavior of light and refraction and reflection and so on that they can arrive by theoretical conceptual means at a knowledge that there are certain differences in light waves in an area where they don't directly perceive the differences. Now, the relevant point is here. No form of sense perception, for the reasons I argued last time, can be wrong or mistaken, because each one is specified whenever the person makes the claim as this is my form of perceiving. You can, however, make a difference between forms of sense perception. You can define a difference in terms of the amount of information that a given form of sense perception gives you directly and the type of information which a given form of sense perception gives you directly. Now, every type of sense perception is limited. It gives you only so much information. But you could say, for instance, one person is in a better position than another because he has more senses, or his senses are able to discriminate more differences directly than the other person is. So in this sense, in terms of the quantity of information given you directly, you can make a distinction. But that doesn't mean that the person who gets less information directly is therefore getting incorrect information. It merely means he must arrive by conceptual, inferential means at differences which you are given directly. Now, the point to observe here is that nobody can be given everything by sense perception. Here again, A is A. Well, if you get certain things by sense perception, you are not given other things. And here the most obvious example is, people say, well, wouldn't our senses be better if we could directly perceive atoms? And of course the answer is no. If we had the scale of perception which gave us direct experience of atoms, then on that level we would never be able to perceive the Empire State Building. Macroscopic objects would be entirely outside of us. Imagine a species that was able directly to perceive atoms going back and forth. Well, now, for a species with that type of sense perception, the Einstein of that species would be the one that figured out by inference that there are macroscopic objects. See, because it would be just caught directly in a cloud of whirling particles. It wouldn't directly get the macroscopic world. Now we get the macroscopic world and infer the microscopic one. Now in either case, every form of perception is limited and gives you only some information directly. And the rest is a question of reasoning from what you do get to the part that you don't get. So I would say, no, this colorblind man is not wrong. Do we have any? What is the next course when? I don't know. The next course that I offer will be one of two possibilities. Either it will be the first half of this course, that is from Thales to Hume, or I'm also considering the possibility of giving a full course on the philosophy of Objectivism. That is at present undecided. As to when it will be, I would like to finish the book that I'm working on now, and I do not expect, therefore, that it will be in the very immediate future, but it will be announced in plenty of time in the Objectivist. I have been asked, I may say several times, when is my book coming out? I tell you only this, my present plan is to complete the manuscript within a year, and you must then allow the publisher a certain number of months to go from manuscript form to published form, and therefore it would probably be sometime in the spring or summer of '72 when the book would actually be issued. Now, do we have one brief one that we could use as a finale here. All right, let's take this. Since the good is man's life, why wouldn't it be proper to stop a man from acting self-destructively? Since it can be objectively shown that he isn't acting correctly, why can't he be made to act correctly? Well, now this is a good example of the viewpoint that the good is intrinsic. The implication is something is good for this man even if he does not himself see that it is good for him. And there cannot be a state of affairs in which something is good for a person that he himself does not see and evaluate. This doesn't mean evaluation is subjective, but it does mean that the value in question is not intrinsic. Even if a course of action were such that you knew that if only the person saw it, it would be the right thing for him to do, so long as he himself honestly does not see it, it is not the right thing for him to do. The good is not intrinsic. It requires an evaluation by the individual, and it can't be good till he sees it. Now, you can think of a perfectly obvious example, which we could multiply given time. Suppose that you are a marriage counselor, and you know, and let us suppose you actually do know, you have exhaustively interviewed two people, a man and a woman, and you are really convinced on the basis of depth analysis of the values that they hold, things they care about, their interests and so on, their ideas, that they are ideally compatible with each other and that they would have a happy marriage. And let's suppose that by some means, I don't know how you would have arrived at that, but suppose that it was actually the case. In effect, if there was a God, he would say, yes, these two really go together. Only they don't see it. Now, would you see the preposterousness of saying to these two people, let's suppose they've just begun to date and they have a certain interest in each other, but they don't yet know each other that well, and they have not yet on their own decided that they really are right for each other. Would you see the preposterousness of saying, well, I know that you have the right values in common, therefore, I hold a gun to your back and say you got to get married because it's for your own welfare in the long run, I know. Now, you would see perfectly clearly in a case like that would be the surest way to make them mortal enemies if you forced them to get married, even if they were ultimately ideally compatible. Because in a relationship like that, and I use that just as an example, obviously they can't be right for each other until they actually see it of their own judgment. And you imagine, project what happened. The first time there was the faintest disagreement or the faintest quarrel between them, which happens even between ideally married couples, they would immediately take that as evidence that they're not suited to each other. Insofar as they have any independence or any initiative or self-respect, they would resent bitterly the idea of somebody being thrust at them. They would magnify anything into evidence that they're not compatible with each other, and the thing would go completely sour. Even if, as I say, they were ideal candidates, the whole thing depends upon they themselves seeing it. And you see, here's a perfect case where the value judgment is neither intrinsic nor subjective. Not intrinsic because their marriage isn't the right thing to do until they see it. Not subjective. Consult the divorce courts for the idea that, well, you marry anybody you feel like and it can make you happy if you feel it's going to. Here's a case where, again, the facts and the human evaluation is required. So, as a brief, obvious example of the point that even if you know that a person should take a certain course of action, it can't be right for him until he sees it. And the most you can do if you're interested is try to persuade him and get him to see it, appeal to his mind. But it is not right for him if it must be performed by force. Well, on that note, let's conclude. Thank you very much.
All material in this program is protected by copyright and may not be reproduced in any form or manner, nor played before a live audience without the express written permission of the producer, the Ayn Rand Institute. For further information or to order other products, please visit estore.aynrand.org or call 1-800-729-6149.